This is In Character. I'm your host, Gerard Robinson, Vice President for Education at the Advanced Studies in Culture Foundation. Hello, my name is Gerard Robinson, and welcome back to another session of In Character. Gary from Indiana was with me when we had a group conversation about families and about educators and their role in defining what it looks like and how to be helpful. So to do a deeper one-on-one conversation, Gary, welcome back to In Character.
Hi, everybody.
So before we get started, tell me, who's Gary?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, it's interesting. So I started out my career as a science teacher and then moved into administration after receiving the Michigan Teacher of the Year honor in 2014, and eventually launched my own consulting firm with my wife, Saga Educators. And so we are now in our fourth year of private practice educational consulting, where we do executive coaching for students and adults to help them be more successful in their personal, professional, and academic lives. We also do corporate training workshops as well, but with the pandemic, some of those things have not been happening like they used to. But that's what we do. We really try to help people build their skills, executive function skills in particular, and utilize those to the best of their ability in whatever part of life they find themselves.
What attracted you to the teaching profession, and then talk about how it was to transition out of the classroom?
Yeah, this is a really important part of my story, actually. So what brought me into the teaching profession is actually an eye disease that I had as a young child, took my sight in my teens and early 20s. And by the time I got to college, I wasn't able to see well enough to drive myself to school or to be able to read my textbooks. So I had to have cornea transplant surgery in order to allow me to be able to see again in both eyes. Well, the surgery was very successful, and you might say that it not only gave me my sight back, but it gave me a new vision for what I wanted to do with my life. And up until that point, I always knew that I wanted to help people, and I had a love for science that ultimately I thought I would use in medicine, but my eye disease made it really difficult to go into the medical profession. So I chose something that I thought would allow me to help others and use my love of science. So that's what brought me into science education. But I was equally passionate about saving lives and helping people in education as I would have been in medicine. And so that opened up a lot of opportunities in the classroom for me to take on leadership roles and opportunities with my students in my school. And eventually the Teacher of the Year opportunity taught me some great leadership skills and opened up new opportunities for me to go into a formal leadership role. So I went into school education leadership and did work at both the high school and the elementary level as an administrator. And then that transition, as you kind of asked about, was an interesting one. I always knew that I wanted to have a bigger impact in education and a bigger impact than I could from a single classroom. And I thought for a lot of reasons that that was something I could do being in a job, so to speak, at the front office of a school. What I found out very quickly is something that I knew all along, that the most important work happens with those one-on-one interactions between teacher and student. And so the real influence that happens in schools happens at the classroom level. It doesn't happen at a larger level. But it is true that you can have influence at any level. What I now see looking back on it is that the influence that I wanted to have still and ultimately comes through teaching. And so transitioning into educational consulting, I knew that I wanted teaching to be a major component of my work. And so now I spend my time teaching one-on-one and in small groups with young people, as well as teaching adults in one-on-one coaching settings, or as well as in workshops and professional development opportunities.
So as someone trained in science, how has that scientific thinking or the way that you approach problem solving served you as both a leader, an administrator, and a coach?
Yeah, this is a really important piece. I would say, again, my background training before I got into education was in medicine. And so I spent some time working in a kidney disease clinic and in an ophthalmology laboratory and in a hospital setting. And so, like I mentioned earlier, education is something that was a second career for me after, first aiming towards medicine. So I always had that scientific mind about research, that idea that things don't just happen by chance, that there are no coincidental encounters, that there's reason behind things, that you can always ask that question, what will happen if I do this? And what will happen if I don't do this? And so from the classroom level, one of the biggest things that I found in my teaching practice that allowed me to be sort of research oriented and scientific minded was with the grading and assessment practices that I implemented at the classroom level. So I always had a hunch that the way that we grade student work and give feedback on assessments wasn't enough, that it wasn't telling the whole picture of what students knew or were able to do. And so I embarked on an action research project over the course of several years to pilot a standards-based assessment and reporting process in my classroom. Well, then as a school administrator, that was something that I still had a big heart for, and was then able to provide professional development to be able to support teachers in implementing those same kinds of practices for their students. But ultimately, as a school leader, I would say one of the biggest things that has a scientific orientation to it is the way that we use feedback loops, the way that we use information that we get about how our school is doing, whether that be the students, the teachers, the families, whether that be academic or non-academic markers, how we use that information to provide us feedback, and then what we do with that feedback to create action creates this loop that is very scientific in nature and very much like the so-called scientific method, that we are noticing something that's happening, asking questions about it, we are doing things with a hypothesis that it may or may not have a certain outcome, and we use feedback to help us know whether or not that outcome is what we expected, and then we take action based upon those outcomes. So it's, I think, an integral, underlying, and foundational piece to the work that I do and to the work that many school leaders and educators are doing all over the place.
You talked about creating an assessment, and for both teachers and principals, one of the tough questions they receive from the public, from lawmakers, philanthropists, do we test too much? As a leader who had to work with teachers, you were also in the classroom as well, how do you respond to the questions, either we test too much or maybe we test enough, but what's the importance of why we have assessments?
Yeah, this is I think one of the most important things that's being asked and being talked about right now in education. And so for me, what I find most important about this conversation is that we do need to have ways to get feedback on how our students are doing. Ultimately, the output of schools is learned individuals. And so if we aren't producing individuals who are more learned because of the fact that they've been with us, then we aren't actually providing that value. Now, whether that learning is strictly academic, whether it's social emotional, whether it's skill based or something else, that is a different story. And so what we are assessing and how we are assessing and why we are assessing are three different questions that often I find get lumped into the same conversation about so-called testing too much. So in my opinion, I think it's important that we start with the why. Why are we doing assessments? Why are we even testing in the first place? Well, we want to know if our students are learning what we're teaching them, and we want to know, based on feedback, if our teaching methods, our curricula, etc., are working. So that gives us important feedback that's actually part of the curriculum cycle. By delivering curriculum, we can then assess students and then evaluate practices and curricula to see if they are serving our intended outcomes. But how we go about doing that sometimes can be very difficult in school settings. And what I mean by that is that there are two types of assessments, really. There are obtrusive ones that basically mean you have to stop everything else in order for the assessment to happen. And then there are unobtrusive ones, assessments that happen while learning is taking place in the classroom, and they don't interrupt the flow at all. I think the big difficulty that a lot of people have with testing is the obtrusive types of testing and the methods for delivering testing that take up days, weeks, or in some cases even months of the school year where students could be learning, and they are overtaxing students' executive functions. They're overtaxing the decision-making and resources and capacity of the educators in the schools, and they are essentially taking away key time and key resources from teaching the actual curricula that we are set out to do by spending time trying to assess whether or not it's working. So in all of this, we have to have a balance. I think it's really important that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater on this. It's not enough to say we're doing too much testing, therefore no more testing, because now it's really difficult to get that important feedback and data. But at the same time, when I was an elementary school principal, the testing window lasted 6 to 8 weeks, where we were spending the course of almost 2 months interrupting learning for elementary school students on an almost daily basis to some extent or another to deliver these assessments that the state required. So that's a really big issue with the how. So I don't have an issue with the why. I think what we end up seeing is a lot of difficulties with how it's delivered and then what ends up happening. But ultimately, the purpose of assessment is to provide feedback to inform what we do as educators. And I don't know how to say that we could do our jobs well without having feedback of that kind.
No, great response. I believe that most of our teachers are entrepreneurs. And by that, I mean entrepreneurship is a way of thinking, often taking challenges and seeing them as an opportunity and not a problem. You're a teacher, administrator who decided to take your entrepreneurial skills to the next level. What recommendations do you have for either teachers or administrators who are thinking about taking the entrepreneurial step to the next level?
Yeah, this is a really fun question for me to be able to respond to because it's something that I get to do now in my consulting work. I work with a lot of adults who are looking to make a career change or a transition out of their current situation with work, and many of them are entrepreneur minded and want to do something a little bit more flexible. So I guess I would come back to the same question that I would ask about assessment, which is why. So the first thing that I would tell anybody who's thinking about applying their entrepreneurial skills or mindset is why do you want to do this? And a great way to find out why you want to do it is to ask yourself who or what matters to you in your life. Now, that's not just about in your work, but that's in your life. So maybe these are the people in your family. Maybe this is you think it's important to have flexibility in your time. Maybe you think having the ability to choose your own schedule. Whatever those things are that you value, that's a very first and foremost step to help inform why you would do this. But to move into the how from why you are doing it, you have to figure out what is your present reality. Is your present reality that you have time to do this on the side and you can start building something a little at a time and eventually have a plan in the future to take it full time? Or do you have the ability right now to make a full transition and go at it 100% and take your entrepreneurial idea right into startup mode and get going with it? Those are questions to be asking as well. But even after you get to the how will I do this, we come down to these steps of what will I actually do? And in that case, I want to tell people to do what you're good at. So you have to know your strengths, you've got to know your skill set, you've got to know your areas of expertise, and you've got to know what value can you add to others. Because ultimately, the work that we do as educators, whether it's in a school or in a private setting or in a public setting somewhere else, we add value to other people. And so if we can't identify what it is that we do that can add value for others, it's going to be really hard to take any work that we would do, entrepreneurial or not, and make that something that converts to a unique opportunity. But I think it's a great opportunity for a lot of people. I know it isn't the best fit for everyone, and each personality may or may not appeal to the entrepreneurial opportunities that are out there. But if you are entrepreneurial minded, I would start at the smallest level possible with the work that you do now and get creative about it. Look for ways to branch it outside the four walls of your school or your classroom or your area and see what you can do with the things you're already doing to get those out there and connecting with others. And I think you'll start to see seeds plant in your mind about how you can grow this idea future.
No, that's another great response. I think it's one that we should all adhere to. And I think families, parents, nonprofit executives, and philanthropists who are thinking of ways to better partner with schools to create a culture of learning could take some lessons from what you've shared with us at this time. Gary, thank you again for joining me for another conversation of In Character, and I look forward to future conversations.
My pleasure, Gerard. Thanks so much for having me.